Oysters have long been a keystone species of the Chesapeake Bay, both ecologically and economically. Each oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day, helping maintain a healthy marine ecosystem. At its peak in the 1880s, the bay yielded around 20 million bushels of oysters annually, but overharvesting, pollution, and disease diminished the population to less than 3% of historical levels. This dramatic decline reflects the phenomenon known as the tragedy of the commons, where unregulated exploitation of public resources results in environmental collapse. The tragic story of the bay's oysters exemplifies the importance of balancing watermen's rights to harvest with the government's responsibility of sustainable management. Chesapeake Oyster Wars: How the Tragedy of the Commons Demonstrates a Need for Maritime Rights and Responsibilities. In 1608, Captain John Smith described the Chesapeake Bay as a goodly bay, rich with forests, rivers, and ideal land for settlement. He witnessed the abundance of oysters lying as thick as stones, so prominent that ships had to navigate around them. The Chesapeake Bay region thrived on its oysters, which played a central role in Native American culture and cuisine. For over a century, the bay's oysters supported local sustenance and a booming trade. Commercial fishermen, known as watermen, traditionally harvested oysters through tonguing, using tools like nippers to pull oysters from shallow waters. By the early 1800s, overharvesting of oysters in New England forced northern watermen to migrate south, seeking new opportunities within the Chesapeake Bay. They brought dredging, a method using heavy baskets to scour the seafloor, destroying entire oyster beds for greater profits.
Earlier on in the history of the oyster wars, as early as the 1820s, when the New England dredge boats came to the Chesapeake Bay, there was a lot of competition, not only between the out-of-state watermen in these big sailboats dragging these big dredges, but even with the different counties. If you were from a different county and came into another county waters, those residents considered you a foreigner, and they didn't want you competing with their livelihood. So between the dredge boats from the New England states and other watermen from different counties, there was constant conflict.
With no rules to govern harvesting, many oystermen, chasing the profits of what was known as white gold, harvested an exuberant amount of oysters. In response, Maryland and Virginia passed laws to control harvesting, beginning with a Virginian ban on dredging in 1811, with Maryland following suit in 1820. However, without enforcement, these laws were ignored. The invention of canning and the expansion of railroads in the mid-1800s dramatically increased demand for oysters. By the 1870s, the booming industry produced over 9 million bushels harvested annually in Maryland. Maryland's eastern shore not only had a prosperous economy, but also became a critical escape route as part of the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman relied on black watermen and the Chesapeake Bay's waterways to transport enslaved people to freedom under the cover of night. The oystering industry also provided financial freedom for African Americans. Black watermen, making up a third of oystermen, worked alongside white watermen and earned equal pay per bushel. Their labor brought stability, making them a vital part of the bay's maritime heritage and economy. In 1868, Maryland created the Maryland State Fishery Force, known as the Oyster Navy or Oyster Police, to enforce the frequently broken oyster harvesting laws, intending to protect the rapidly depleting oyster beds. With just 2 steamboats and a few sailing vessels, they patrolled nearly 5,000 square miles of the bay. Facing heavily armed illegal dredgers, the job was dangerous. Captain Hunter Davidson described the lawlessness, stating, "Oystermen will risk any weather and are willing to kill to reach the handsome profits." However, the Oyster Navy was also criticized for its heavy-handed tactics. Violent confrontations, including the sinking of dredging boats and exchanges of cannon fire, became commonplace. The Potomac River's disputed waterline boundaries fueled conflicts between Maryland Oyster Police and Virginia watermen.
Well, they went through this time where Maryland said they owned the oysters that were out in the river, and Virginia didn't agree with it so much, so they got into this whole war about who owned the oysters. It got to the point where Maryland felt like Virginia was catching too many of the oysters by dredging, so they forbade them to dredge. They would only allow them to go out and tow. Well, the Virginia men didn't feel that was right, so they would actually go out at nighttime. Well, the Maryland police caught on to what Virginia oystermen were doing, and they started going out there with boats with guns on the fronts of them. And they would actually go out there and shoot at them to try and get them to go back into the Virginia.
Well, police practices at that time, it was not uncommon that any violator trying to escape apprehension would be shot at. A burglar, for example, caught red-handed climbing out the back window of your house trying to run away would probably be shot at by the police. So it was no different in conservation law enforcement. If you were observed committing a violation and you were trying to get away, the police would shoot. Today, we don't do that. They have to be pretty serious offenses. So again, the commercial watermen or the oyster pirates, however you want to refer to them, if they were caught in the act of committing a violation, they were trying to get away, it would not be unusual for police to shoot at them. No record of anybody being shot until that day in 1959.
In the early hours of April 8, 1959, 3 Virginia men illegally dredged 7 bushels of oysters near Swan Point, Maryland. As the crew was returning to Colonial Beach, Virginia, Maryland's Oyster Police began pursuing the crew, firing 27 shots, killing Berkeley Muse, a Virginia farmer, and wounding another. At least 1 bullet hit a nearby building on the shoreline. The incident, claimed by critics as the officers going too far, sparked public outrage and renewed calls for reforming the rights of law enforcement versus their responsibility to use force appropriately. The death of Berkeley Muse led to the retraining of the Maryland Oyster Police, ensuring they enforce laws responsibly, abiding by the 1958 Bi-State Potomac River Compact, which classified illegal dredging as a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine, up to a year in prison, or confiscation of the vessel and equipment. The compact formally established watermen's rights and privileges to harvest and the police's responsibility for enforcement. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy signed the bill establishing the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, officially ending the Oyster Wars. As the Oyster Wars came to a close, the struggle to protect the bay's oysters was still far from over. In 1962, the first outbreak of MSX, a parasite linked to experimental Japanese oyster imports, infected over 40% of Chesapeake oysters, causing Maryland harvests to collapse to just 2 million bushels, only 10% of their 1884 peak. Ironically, 30 years earlier, in 1932, Dr. Reginald Truitt of the University of Maryland's Chesapeake Biological Laboratory had warned that introducing foreign oysters could cause devastation to local species. He advocated for a ban on Japanese oyster imports, delaying the spread of MSX for 30 years. However, as part of experimentation to replenish local oyster stocks, Japanese oysters were eventually introduced in the 1950s, leading to the MSX outbreak Truitt had predicted. By the 1990s, pollution, droughts, hurricanes, and diseases devastated oyster harvests, resulting in the majority of watermen leaving oystering for other fisheries. Once capable of filtering the entire bay in just a few days, oyster beds now take nearly a year to clean the water, leading to excessive nutrient buildup and the formation of dead zones, areas with low oxygen that diminish fish, crabs, and other marine life. As a result, studies showed that by 1990, only 3% of oysters remained from their historical levels. This crisis highlighted the need for systematic and coordinated management to protect the bay's ecosystem. Today, oyster restoration efforts vary by state. Virginia has embraced oyster farming, making it the East Coast's leading producer, while Maryland prioritizes oyster sanctuary initiatives. Environmental agencies, alongside nonprofits, continue working to balance watermen's rights for harvesting with the government's responsibility of appropriate law enforcement and conservation. Building on the legacy of the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, marine resources within 3 miles offshore, including the Great Lakes, are now managed by 4 interstate fishery commissions, while federal waters, from 3 to 200 miles offshore, are overseen by 8 regional fishery councils established by the Magnuson-Stevens Act in 1976, ensuring sustainable fishing to protect marine ecosystems. The Oyster Wars remain a powerful example of the tragedy of the commons. Where there is boom, there is greed. The tragic story of the Chesapeake Bay's oysters reminds us that the right to harvest natural resources comes with the duty to protect them. By learning from the past, we can all share the responsibility of preserving the Chesapeake Bay, allowing oysters to thrive once again, and ensuring that our future generations can enjoy its waters for years to come.